Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that for most of early human history, societies focused almost entirely on managing conditions directly in front of them. Irrigation, food storage, land division, temple accounting, and local dispute settlement all emerged as practical responses to environmental pressure. Innovation existed, but it was anchored to immediate necessity. Communities built solutions because circumstances forced them to. However, material from the late 3rd to early 2nd millennium BCE shows a noticeable shift in the cognitive pattern of several ancient cultures. People began producing ideas that were not tied to daily survival or political administration. They started constructing abstract models, visions of justice, reflections on uncertainty, interpretations of meaning, and hypothetical scenarios with no physical counterpart. This indicates that imagination was becoming a deliberate intellectual tool, not simply a narrative extension of ritual tradition. Mesopotamia provides some of the clearest evidence of this change. Alongside the usual economic and legal tablets, scribes created works that had no administrative function. Debates between symbolic characters, dialogues examining misfortune, and texts that openly question whether the universe is fair appear in this period. These compositions explore patterns of thought rather than events. They analyze behavior, motivation, and consequence, showing that ideas themselves had become subjects worthy of examination. Egypt experienced a comparable development. Instructional texts such as the Instruction of Tehotep and the Instruction of Merikari discuss responsible leadership, generational consequences, and the limits of authority. Unlike earlier religious material, these works attempt to understand social stability as a product of human decision-making. They point to a growing interest in long-term ethics rather than immediate ritual obligations. In the Levant, early covenant traditions took shape around the same time. These frameworks imagined a moral order that extended beyond individual leaders or momentary crises. Such thinking required projecting principles into the future and assuming that behavior could shape collective outcomes. This is a form of long-range conceptual reasoning not typically seen in earlier periods. Advances in writing accelerated the process. Cuneiform became more standardized, hieroglyphic practice more efficient, and early alphabetic scripts emerged. Writing enabled cumulative memory, which in turn allowed comparison. Once ideas could be stored, they could be revised, challenged, and reinterpreted. Knowledge was no longer tied to the lifespan of a storyteller or official. Trade expanded the cognitive environment even further. Merchants carried stories, proverbs, and analytical methods across regions. When ideas move between cultures with different pressures and priorities, they often transform into tools rather than traditions. Communities saw that explanations could change, that alternative perspectives existed. Taken together, these developments indicate a clear turning point. Humans were no longer satisfied with documenting the world as it was. They began to explore possibilities, how life might function under different assumptions, what principles could organize societies, and why meaning mattered beyond survival. This mental shift did not immediately produce technological revolutions or philosophical schools, but it created the essential foundation for both. It opened the cognitive space where alternatives could be imagined and evaluated. And once that space emerged, symbolic systems, writing, images, signs took on a new role. Not just as tools of administration, but as instruments capable of extending the reach of thought itself. That development becomes clear once we look at how symbols evolved, from simple markers into frameworks for expressing increasingly complex ideas. As abstract thought became more common, the next major development was the emergence of symbolic systems capable of supporting it. Symbols were not new. Early writing had long recorded quantities, names, and transactions, but during the early 2nd millennium BCE, these systems began operating at a different cognitive level. They started enabling thought instead of merely documenting it. Cuneiform provides a clear example. Originally a system for counting and marking goods, it gradually acquired the capacity to express categories, contrasts, and conceptual relationships. Lexical lists from cities such as Nippur, Ur, and Sippar show scribes arranging information by function, environment, and association rather than simple quantity. This indicates a deliberate attempt to organize knowledge in structured form. The fact that such lists were copied repeatedly in scribal schools suggests that training the mind to recognize patterns had become a cultural priority. Egypt followed a parallel but distinct trajectory. Hieroglyphic inscriptions retained their ceremonial role, But texts began to incorporate more analytical content. Moral and instructional writings used symbols not only to communicate authority but to articulate general principles: how leaders should act, how disputes should be resolved, how stability could be preserved. This transition shows that symbols were becoming tools for modeling rules rather than merely confirming hierarchy. Visual symbolism also grew more sophisticated. Reliefs in temples and palaces compressed complex social and cosmic relationships into scenes that could be read quickly by educated viewers. A single panel might illustrate legitimacy, divine approval, political duty, and ethical expectation all at once. These images functioned as conceptual diagrams long before formal diagrams existed. They allowed ideas to be grasped as integrated structures rather than isolated statements. This expansion of symbolic capacity had a direct cognitive impact. Once information could be represented abstractly, people could manipulate it without relying solely on memory or oral explanation. Comparison became easier. Contradictions became more visible. Revisions became possible because the previous version existed outside the mind. Thinking became increasingly externalized, supported by physical media that preserved thought in stable form. Trade networks amplified this effect. Symbols moved across regions, along with goods. A merchant dealing in copper from Anatolia, textiles from Mesopotamia, and cedar from the Levant encountered multiple writing systems and symbolic conventions. Exposure to different symbolic environments encouraged reinterpretation. Certain motifs appear in widely separated regions because their underlying ideas such as kingship, justice, or divine order proved useful beyond their cultural origins. This diffusion demonstrates that symbols had become flexible carriers of meaning rather than fixed components of local tradition. Crucially, the growing sophistication of symbolic systems allowed people to express ideas that could not be captured through direct observation alone. The concept of obligation, the logic of reciprocity, the structure of time, or the moral weight of intention all required representation that could go beyond physical experience. Symbols made such representation possible. The result was a meaningful expansion of human cognitive range. Once societies could encode concepts, they could extend them, question them, and reinterpret them. Knowledge became cumulative rather than situational. Ideas could survive changes in leadership, climate, or political structure. They could travel, evolve, and return in new forms. And as symbols allowed ideas to move more freely and persist more reliably, something else began to happen. Stories built from these symbols started circulating widely enough to influence how entire regions understood themselves. That shift becomes clearer when we look at the growing role of narrative, which soon became the most effective way to transmit and transform ideas across societies. As symbolic systems matured, they enabled the rise of something even more powerful: narrative. Once ideas could be recorded and transmitted, stories began traveling across cities, regions, and generations with a stability oral memory alone could not provide. They became a medium through which communities explored experiences that extended beyond their immediate environment. Signs of this transition are clear in Mesopotamian literature of the early 2nd millennium BCE. Narratives, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enmerkar, and the Lord of Arata, and Inanna's Descent, circulated far beyond the locations where they were first composed. These works examined ambition, leadership, loyalty, uncertainty, and the limits of power. They were not simple myths tied to ritual calendars. They functioned as frameworks for thinking about social behavior and personal responsibility. Their continued copying in scribal schools suggests that they were treated as intellectual material, worth analyzing and reinterpreting. Egyptian texts reveal a similar shift. Stories like The Eloquent Peasant and the Story of Sinuhe focus on persuasion, justice, and identity rather than divine authority. Their plots depend on reasoning, decision-making, and consequences, presenting situations where individuals must evaluate what is right, rather than follow prescribed roles. These narratives show that storytelling had become a means of illustrating ethical dilemmas, helping communities reflect on the complexities of social life. Narrative traditions in the Levant took yet another form. They emphasized memory and collective identity, often grounded in mobile or decentralized communities. Without monumental architecture to anchor authority, stories served as cultural infrastructure. They maintained cohesion across distance and change, preserving a sense of shared origin, obligation, and expectation. This constant adaptation forced storytellers to update and interpret meaning rather than merely recite older versions. Trade played a significant role in spreading and transforming narratives. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Ugarit, Hattusa, and Mari shows extensive overlap in mythic themes and symbolic motifs. Ideas moved between merchant groups, diplomatic envoys, and migrant workers, gradually shaping regional intellectual patterns. A story encountered in one setting could be retold in another, with modified emphasis, allowing it to absorb new concerns and contexts. The circulation of stories had several long-term consequences for cognitive development. Narratives enabled people to imagine hypothetical situations, evaluate possible outcomes, and compare different courses of action. A story about a failed ruler allowed listeners to consider the risks of poor leadership. A tale of conflict between families encouraged discussion about how disputes should be resolved. Through narrative, communities practiced thinking in alternatives, a skill essential for planning and innovation. Stories also created a form of shared reference. When individuals from different backgrounds recognized the same narrative patterns, they could communicate abstract ideas more easily. This was especially important in multi-ethnic urban centers and long-distance trade networks, where people needed common intellectual ground despite differing traditions. Narrative offered that ground. Perhaps the most important development was that stories gained autonomy. Once they began circulating beyond the control of temples and courts, they could influence communities independently of official structures. A ruler might promote a particular myth, but alternative versions still spread through trade, education, and informal social exchange. Stories became a parallel system of thought, one that could reinforce political authority or quietly challenge it. As narratives accumulated, they created an environment where people could compare explanations, observe inconsistencies, and consider motives behind established traditions. This comparison gradually encouraged deeper examination not only of stories themselves, but of the assumptions embedded within them. That process marks the emergence of genuine reflection, a stage in which societies begin analyzing their own beliefs rather than simply inheriting them. As stories circulated more widely, they exposed people to multiple interpretations of the same themes: justice, power, loyalty, loss, and responsibility. When different versions of a narrative coexisted, they encouraged listeners and readers to compare them. Comparison naturally led to reflection, a kind of thinking that had been far less visible in earlier periods. Evidence of this development appears first in scribal texts from Mesopotamia. In addition to copying traditional myths, scribes produced compositions that examine questions rather than assert answers. Dialogues, such as the Babylonian Theodicy, portray two individuals debating whether the world is fair. Neither side wins. The value of the text lies in the examination itself. Other works explore conflicts between duty and personal interest, or the tension between human effort and divine intention. These texts shift from describing the world to evaluating it. Egyptian materials show a related transformation. Periods of instability encouraged writers to explore uncertainty directly. The dialogue of a man with his soul expresses internal conflict with a level of psychological detail unusual for its time. Instructional works aimed at rulers emphasize the limits of authority and the need for self-critique and implicit recognition that leadership depends on judgment rather than ritual alone. Such documents indicate that reflection had become part of political thought, not simply personal contemplation. Reflection took different shapes in other regions. In the Levant, stories adapted across generations provided opportunities to reconsider moral expectations. Communities used narrative revision to interpret new circumstances, demonstrating that traditions could be evaluated rather than repeated unchanged. In Anatolia, mythological reinterpretations found in Hittite archives reveal that foreign narratives were sometimes adopted, reshaped, and integrated to address local concerns. These adjustments show conscious engagement with meaning, not passive inheritance. What ties all of this activity together is a growing awareness that established explanations were not absolute. Myths could conflict with each other. Laws could contradict values expressed in stories. Royal inscriptions could present an idealized world different from lived reality. As people encountered these inconsistencies, they began weighing alternative possibilities. Reflection became a tool for navigating competing interpretations. This shift had a broader social impact. Judicial records from Mesopotamia show an increased emphasis on intention, not just outcome. Egyptian administrative texts discuss how policies should be reassessed in response to changing conditions. Levantine traditions treat moral behavior as a collective responsibility, implying that communities shared in the process of evaluating right and wrong. These developments suggest that thought, rather than tradition alone, was beginning to shape institutions. Reflection also influenced how history was perceived. Instead of treating past events as fixed examples, writers began analyzing their causes. They asked why cities fell, why rulers failed, why alliances succeeded or collapsed. This analytical approach marked a turning point. The past became something to interpret, not simply something to remember. By the early first millennium BCE, reflection was not an isolated intellectual exercise. It was woven into the way communities explained their world. People recognized that ideas could be tested, revised, or replaced. This recognition made it possible to build systems of thought rather than rely on inherited patterns. And once societies began organizing ideas into systems, categorizing, comparing, and refining them, thinking itself acquired structure. That structural shift becomes clearer when we look at how early thinkers moved from isolated reflections to coherent frameworks designed to interpret a wide range of experiences. As reflection became a recognized intellectual habit, certain communities began approaching ideas with greater structure. Instead of examining questions one at a time, they started seeking broader patterns, relationships between observations, consistent principles beneath moral expectations, and recurring themes across stories. This shift did not produce formal philosophy in the later classical sense, but it created the conditions under which systematic reasoning could emerge. In Mesopotamia, this development appears in an expanding body of educational material. Lexical lists grew longer and more precise, organizing the world into categories based on function, environment, or symbolic association. Scribes used these lists not simply to memorize vocabulary but to train analytical thinking. The act of dividing plants, animals, tools, and professions into structured tables suggests an early understanding that knowledge could be mapped. Debate poems reinforced this habit by framing opposing claims and requiring readers to evaluate the logic behind each position. Egypt moved in a different but equally revealing direction. Instructional texts focused on the nature of authority, the responsibilities that accompanied power, and the consequences of leadership decisions. Writers examined why some rulers failed despite ritual legitimacy, while others succeeded through consistency and restraint. This interest in cause and effect indicated that Egyptians were beginning to think about political and moral systems, not just individual actions. In the Levant, structured reasoning took the form of shared moral frameworks that extended beyond personal relationships. Communities articulated norms that bound individuals together, emphasizing obligation and collective stability. Such norms required abstract thinking, because they applied regardless of circumstance or leadership. The logic behind these traditions shows early attempts to define principles that could hold a group together over time. The Aegean region developed its own path toward structured analysis. Contact with Near Eastern cultures introduced new narrative and administrative models. Myths increasingly placed human decision-making at the center of events, encouraging audiences to consider motivation, responsibility, and consequence. These portrayals nudged communities toward more systematic interpretations of human behavior. Across all these regions, the common thread is a shift in how people handled ideas. They were no longer gathering isolated insights. They were arranging them in ways that produced coherence. Knowledge became something that could be organized rather than merely remembered. Once thought acquired structure, it began functioning with a level of independence from tradition, because a principle could be applied even when the original context no longer existed. This development also had social implications. When ideas are organized, they can be compared more easily, and when comparison becomes habitual, differences in reasoning become more noticeable. Communities began seeing that explanations varied not only between cultures but within their own. That awareness encouraged further analysis about conduct, governance, identity, and the purpose of institutions. By the early first millennium BCE, structured thinking had become part of everyday intellectual life in ways that earlier societies never experienced. It did not remove tradition, but it introduced a parallel force, the expectation that ideas should make sense when examined closely. The presence of that expectation would shape how later societies handled power, belief, and knowledge, shifting the balance between what people inherited and what they concluded for themselves. Changes in the way people organized ideas eventually affected how they viewed authority. Once communities grew accustomed to evaluating explanations, it became harder for rulers to rely solely on inherited narratives. Power still depended on ritual and lineage, but the intellectual climate around it had changed. People now compared claims, noticed inconsistencies, and formed their own expectations about what leadership should accomplish. This shift is most noticeable in Mesopotamian reforms during the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE. Administrative archives show deliberate attempts to align governance with principles found in instructional and reflective texts. Leaders issued decrees that aimed to reduce exploitation, regulate taxation, and protect individuals vulnerable to elite pressure. While these policies served political objectives, they also responded to an emerging belief that authority should reflect more than tradition. Rulers needed coherence, something that matched the intellectual environment shaped by structured thought. Egypt experienced a similar adjustment. When the Middle Kingdom restored stability after earlier fragmentation, its rulers emphasized not only divine support but competence and ethical behavior. Royal inscriptions frequently highlighted the king's ability to listen, to judge fairly, and to maintain balance in practical as well as symbolic terms. This indicates that Egyptian political culture had begun assessing leadership through a combination of tradition and rational evaluation. Ritual alone was no longer sufficient. In the Levant, the relationship between ideas and power developed through communal frameworks. Groups that relied less on centralized authority and more on shared norms created forms of governance based on agreement rather than lineage. Their stability depended on whether leaders respected collective expectations. As these expectations grew more defined, authority shifted from something inherited to something that required intellectual credibility. The Aegean world shows yet another expression of the same pattern. As its communities absorbed practices from older urban centers, they incorporated them selectively. Narratives about rulers and heroes began to focus on decision-making rather than divine mandate. These stories encouraged audiences to consider how leaders should act, subtly shifting attention from ritual status to personal judgment. Across these regions, power did not weaken, but its foundation broadened. Rulers were measured not only by ceremonial legitimacy but by whether their actions aligned with emerging conceptual standards. This did not produce democratic institutions, but it introduced a new variable. Leadership now had to be intelligible. Decisions needed justification that fit the reasoning frameworks people had grown accustomed to using. This development affected how societies understood stability. Earlier civilizations saw order as something maintained through cosmic alignment or ancestral precedent. Now, many began linking stability to the quality of decisions made within human institutions. Authority, in other words, started to be judged by outcomes and reasoning, not just tradition. By the 1st millennium BCE, an idea that would have been unthinkable in earlier ages was quietly taking shape. The notion that governance could be evaluated on intellectual grounds. No single reform or text introduced this concept. It emerged from gradual shifts in how communities processed information and compared experiences. As thought gained structure and authority adapted to its presence, another change followed. People who had learned to examine stories, weigh principles, and critique leadership also began considering whether knowledge itself could be organized more effectively, whether understanding the world required methods as consistent as the ideas they had begun to value. A noticeable development appears in the archival practices of the early 1st millennium BCE. Knowledge no longer functioned only as memory. Communities began using information proactively, drawing connections between observations and applying them to new situations. This marks a shift from knowledge as preservation to knowledge as method. In Mesopotamia, the growth of scholarly tablets demonstrates this change clearly. Collections on medicine, astronomy, and omen interpretation show attempts to standardize procedures. Even omen texts, though rooted in tradition, follow patterns that reflect analytical habits. They categorize signs, associate them with outcomes, and compare multiple cases. Whether or not the underlying assumptions hold by modern standards, the structure shows that scholars were increasingly concerned with consistency. Egypt offers a different form of evidence. Administrative papyri from the Middle and New Kingdoms include detailed accounts of resource management, labor distribution, and regional reporting. These documents did more than record transactions. They tracked deviations, assessed trends, and informed adjustments. The fact that officials relied on written data to evaluate conditions demonstrates that information had begun guiding decision-making. Knowledge moved from archive to instrument. In the Levant, early scribal traditions combined practical recording with interpretive commentary. Texts do not simply describe events. They frame them within broader explanations about communal identity or ethical obligation. This indicates that knowledge was increasingly viewed as something that required interpretation, not just storage. Understanding the meaning behind events mattered as much as documenting them. The Aegean region contributes additional evidence through its evolving administrative systems. Linear B tablets from Mycenaean sites show careful monitoring of production, distribution, and labor. While primarily economic, these records reveal that systematic observation was becoming common practice. Patterns mattered. Numbers were not written merely to tally goods, but to manage activity across multiple sectors. Across these regions, the key point is that information was beginning to function independently of ritual authority. Earlier societies treated knowledge mainly as a way to maintain tradition, ensuring that rituals, boundaries, and obligations remained consistent. In the first millennium BCE, however, knowledge began to support adaptation. It allowed officials, scribes, and communities to identify discrepancies, evaluate outcomes, and consider whether established practices met current needs. This shift had a cumulative effect. When people rely on information to make decisions, they inevitably start questioning the reliability of sources, the accuracy of interpretations, and the assumptions underlying existing systems. Knowledge becomes something that can be tested. With testing comes refinement, and with refinement comes the expectation that explanations should hold up under scrutiny. Once that expectation took hold, intellectual life changed. Communities no longer viewed insight as the exclusive domain of tradition or priesthood. They recognized that observation, comparison, and reasoning could produce their own forms of authority. This did not diminish the importance of ritual, but it introduced a parallel stream of legitimacy, one based on understanding rather than inheritance. By this point, the idea that thought could stand on its own had become embedded in daily practices. Tablets, papyri inscriptions, and oral commentary all reveal a consistent movement towards systematic inquiry. People used knowledge to navigate uncertainty, resolve disputes, and manage resources. The process of understanding the world became more deliberate and more structured. And as knowledge gained its functional role, it opened the door to something even more consequential: the recognition that ideas could outlast buildings, rulers, and even the societies that produced them. By the early first millennium BCE, imagination had acquired a role far more significant than creating myths or envisioning deities. It had become a mechanism for shaping institutions, evaluating leadership, organizing knowledge, and modeling alternative possibilities. Through this process, ideas gained durability that physical structures rarely possessed. They could move across regions, survive political collapse, and guide communities long after the original creators were gone. The archaeological record supports this long continuity. Tablets, papyri, and narrative traditions show sustained intellectual activity despite disruptions that erased cities or regimes. What remained was not the architecture or the administrative systems, but the reasoning patterns encoded in texts, symbols, and shared narratives. These patterns allowed later societies to rebuild, reinterpret, and innovate without starting from nothing. In this sense, the most enduring legacy of early civilizations was not the temples they raised or the rulers they celebrated, but the mental frameworks they developed, frameworks that encouraged comparison, evaluation, and adaptation. Once communities recognized that ideas could be analyzed and reapplied, imagination became a practical force with long-term consequences. From that point forward, the future depended less on inherited structures and far more on the concepts humans were able to form. The intellectual foundations of later cultures, law, ethics, interpretation, systematic inquiry grew from this early shift in how people processed experience. Long before formal schools or codified theories existed, communities had already learned to treat ideas as tools that could be examined, adapted, and reapplied. This subtle change, almost invisible in its earliest stages, gave them the ability to assign meaning to events rather than simply endure them. It allowed people to imagine outcomes beyond their immediate circumstances, and to see possibility where earlier generations saw inevitability. In the process, they created a continuity more durable than monuments, a continuity rooted in the patterns of thought that shaped how they understood the world. And once meaning could survive beyond the moment, the structure of the human mind itself became the most influential force in history, the one element capable of reshaping everything that followed. Echoes of Sapiens. If stories like this remind you what it means to be human, subscribe and keep exploring with us.